Why is trust the science the most unscientific thing one could say? Why is the phrase trust the science an attempt to manipulate people who don't understand science? Why is the phrase trust the science a blatant propaganda tool that relies on and exploits people's ignorance about science? Why is it a blatant propaganda tool regardless of whether that propaganda tool is used with good intentions or bad? And why does the phrase trust the science ruin the reputation of science regardless of who is telling you to trust the science? These are some of the questions we'll explore in this video. And keep in mind, this video is a bright brain power test. Not everyone will pass this test. But if you can manage to do that, congratulations! You're well on your way to joining the League of Superhumans. You might even get invited to join the first real-world superhuman megacity. Link in the description for more info. The phrase trust the science is the most unscientific thing one could say because science isn't based on trust. Science doesn't need trust. Science doesn't rely on trust. Science is completely independent of trust. Science is based on skepticism, rigorous testing, and evidence. Trust is not part of the scientific process. Trust is irrelevant in science. Skepticism is one of the core elements of science. And because skepticism is one of the key elements that make science science, asking people to trust the science is an oxymoron. Oxymoron is when someone asks you to be a moron. You don't want to do that? Okay, I just invented a definition, but it's close enough and it's funny. So if someone tells you to trust the science, it could only mean one of two things. Either that person is utterly clueless about science, or that person is seeking to control and manipulate you. It doesn't matter who is urging you to trust the science, it could only mean one of those two things. Either they are clueless about science, or they're trying to manipulate you. From the scientific point of view, asking people to trust the science is utterly idiotic. Unless you want to manipulate people by exploiting their lack of knowledge about science. The most egregious cases of abuse in science have occurred because people trusted the scientists involved. Almost every time people just blindly trust a scientist or a group of scientists, it ends up becoming a case of egregious scam. So rule number one in science, do not trust. Be skeptical about any claims from anyone. Test, retest, and collect evidence. Because if you can't reproduce the claimed results by testing, those claims are probably not true. Especially the so-called rockstar scientists have often proven to be the source of egregious scam and fraud in the past. This phenomenon of rockstar scientists turning out to be the source of egregious scam and fraud occurs on a semi-regular basis, almost like clockwork. But it only ever happens because people decide to trust those scientists, instead of asking for evidence and verifying the results via independent testing. Another important thing to keep in mind, there's no such thing as the science. That doesn't exist. The science is not a thing. The science is not an organization. The science is not an entity of any kind. It doesn't exist. What does exist are people, and different groups of people, and organizations and journals. You get the idea. But here's an interesting thing. Until we get true AGI, none of those organizations or journals or whatever, none of them run by themselves. All of them are run by people. And not just people. There's almost always just one person at the top. So no matter what organization it might be, it always boils down to just one person, one individual, one human. This fact alone should make it crystal clear how brain-dead idiotic it is to think that there's such a thing as the science. There are only a few individual people who decide what to say, They're only individuals who try to represent science on various issues. And that means corruption and conflict of interest is always a possibility. Because ultimately, those who try to represent science are just people, not robots. So when someone urges you to trust the science, that's not even technically possible. Because there's no such thing as the science. There are only individuals who try to speak for science. There might be one individual who is speaking, presenting, or advocating on a given issue. Even when there's a group of scientists involved, there's always just one individual leading the group. One person who is speaking. One person who stands out. So instead of saying, trust the science, the technically correct and the honest thing to say would be, trust this one person who is acting as the spokesperson for this particular issue related to scientific endeavors. But of course, if you put it this way, if you put it in an honest and a non-manipulative way, then immediately a bunch of questions will arise. Questions like, who exactly is funding this person now? And who was giving them money in the past? Who and what is this person associated with? What are the potential conflicts of interest this person might have? And out of those potential conflicts of interest, how many and which conflicts of interest actually exist in this case? You have to assume that conflicts of interest exist because conflicts of interest are as common in science as clouds in the sky. A conflict of interest can be purely ideological in nature. Or it can be a desire to avoid humiliation. A conflict of interest can also be something that threatens to ruin your reputation. There are countless scenarios that could lead to a conflict of interest in scientific work. Other questions you might want to ask are, has any independent third party without those conflicts of interest verified the claims made by the spokesperson or the scientist talking about an issue? And how many independent third parties without those conflicts of interest have tried and failed to replicate the results claimed by the spokesperson? A dog not barking can be even more enlightening and revealing. The bottom line is, when you start treating things honestly and start asking questions like these, you'll find that many talking heads that try to represent the science will evaporate as quickly as a drop of water on a hot stove. The science is not a thing, it doesn't exist, and therefore even if you wanted to trust the science, it's technically impossible to do. You could only trust individuals who try to represent science. But like all people, those individuals are susceptible to corruption and conflict of interest. Of course, in science, there's also a process known as the peer review. And while it's a good process, it's far from perfect. We might be able to improve that process, but peer review will never be perfect because we live in the real world. Imperfections is what makes the real world real. It would be super boring to live in a world without imperfections. Those lovely imperfections is what makes humans unique. So instead of blindly trusting individuals who try to represent science, a more intelligent approach is to remain skeptical, ask questions, and look for evidence. The science doesn't exist because science is a method and a process for discovering knowledge and truth. And if the scientist applying the scientific method happens to be biased, which happens every day, or if that person has a conflict of interest, which happens every other day, then chances are this scientist will concoct something that aligns with their bias but is far away from the truth. And even when there's no conflict of interest or bias, there's never 100% certainty in science. This is why science is so exciting. There's always a chance you might discover something new. But trust is irrelevant in science, and so is consensus. Media monkeys. Some people call them journalists. Often try to mention consensus when they try to push propaganda for something.
Oh, 98% of scientists believe this and that.
That doesn't matter. Consensus in science doesn't matter. Science isn't something that's run by committee. The only thing that matters in science is evidence. And evidence can be weak or strong. The stronger the evidence for a given theory, the more likely it is to be true. Telling people to trust the science is like telling people to trust that their Lord and Savior, is gonna protect them from smallpox. Don't forget that science isn't some magical, infallible unicorn. Science is fallible. Science is fallible because it's just work done by people. And sometimes people make mistakes, sometimes people want to avoid humiliation, sometimes people have conflicts of interest, sometimes people become corrupted. And science doesn't work by consensus. Nobody votes on hypotheses in science. It doesn't matter how many scientists agree on something or how long they have worked in the field. The only thing that matters is the quality of evidence. And if, on your first day of working as a freshman scientist, you find better and more compelling evidence that the theory of someone who has worked in the field for 50 years, if you can prove that their theory is wrong, you win! And the scientific consensus can turn on a dime. There's a long history of things that used to have scientific consensus until they were proven wrong. Trust and consensus is irrelevant in science. All science, all scientific discovery is based on asking questions, being skeptical, testing, and collecting the evidence. And often it can be difficult to figure out which of the hundreds of different pieces of evidence is causing what. But this is what makes science so exciting. Solving those puzzles is amazingly fun. Continuously asking those questions and solving those puzzles is what drives the progress of humanity. And if you like this video, share it with everyone and keep sharing until your screen turns into a rainbow and unicorns come galloping out. Welcoming you to the League of Superhumans. Watch the video linked in the description if you want to know what this superhuman fuss is all about. All that's left to say now is Superhumans. Assemble!